Hello, and thank you very much for attending this session. We're going to be talking about the concept of silent reading fluency with comprehension. And the first half of the session, I will present something about the measurement of silent reading fluency with comprehension, the new measure that is part of aimsweb, and tell you something about how it works and its psychometric properties and some of the information that it has unearthed. The second section will be Dr. Hebert talking about the issue of really focusing on the comprehension side of this measurement. What does it mean to comprehend while you are reading silently with fluency? And what can we learn from this measure or from the research literature about that construct? So let me begin with telling you about the silent reading fluency measure. First of all, fluency is defined by the National Reading Panel in their 2000 report as the ability to recognize words easily, read with greater speed, accuracy, and expression, and better understand what is read. Oral reading fluency is, as you know, the most frequently used method of assessing reading fluency, and it's the number of words read correctly in 1 minute. It has many very powerful benefits. It's sensitive to growth, it's quick, it's very reliable, it correlates relatively highly with measures of reading comprehension, and it permits the examiner to get an evaluation of the student's accuracy as well as their prosody. However, it does have some drawbacks. It does use examiner time. It does not require that the student comprehend, even though they have to attend. They don't necessarily have to comprehend what they're reading. It involves an oral motor performance and coordination between the visual and the motor activities. It's less predictive at higher grade levels than at elementary levels. And perhaps most importantly, it is not what older students and adults actually do when they're reading, which is to read silently with comprehension. And this is what they need to be able to do in order to be successful in school. So the need, as we saw it about 4 years ago when this particular development project began, is to develop a measure of comprehension-based silent reading rate that provides the benefits of oral reading fluency in an authentic way. So these are the objectives of our development process. We wanted to measure the rate of reading grade level material with broad comprehension, that is essentially getting the general meaning of what they've read. This is not about inference at a detailed level. It's not about comparing texts or the more sophisticated aspects of reading comprehension as outlined in CCSS. This is about getting a general understanding of what you are reading. It should resemble actual silent reading. It should be computer administered in order to be efficient. It should be reliable, valid, and sensitive to growth, as ORF are. And it should be brief. And being brief is especially important if it is to be used in progress monitoring. So aimsweb's silent reading fluency is the result of that developmental effort. And essentially, the way it works is that the student reads something on screen. When the student is ready, when they're satisfied that they have understood what they read, they go on to the next screen. And there they see a very simple multiple choice question which they have to answer without looking back at the text. The questions are very easy, and if the student really got a general sense of what they read, they should be able to answer the question correctly. So ideally, the questions would be answered correctly by virtually all students. The reason for having the question is to make the student attend while they are reading, because they don't know what they're going to be asked about. They need to attend to what they are reading and extract meaning from the passage. The score on the silent reading fluency test is the rate of reading the segments, that is the number of words on the screen that they read divided by the amount of time that they spent on that screen before they went ahead to the question. Now the score is only meaningful if the student had a minimal level of accuracy on the questions, because if they didn't, then they were not reading with comprehension. Here's an example of how this works. I'll skip over the instructions, but basically the instructions can give some sample items and convey the notion the students should move through this as quickly as they can while understanding. So this is This is the first segment. So a student would see this on the screen. When they are ready, they click Next, and they have this question. They'll choose their answer, and they get feedback, which flashes for about 1 second on the screen before they move to the next segment. This is the next segment of that same story. Again, when they're ready, they click Next, choose their answer, get feedback. And at the end of the 4 segments, which make up a story, they get overall feedback on how many of the 4 questions they answered correctly, and some encouragement to try to get at least 3 of the 4 questions correct on each story that they read. And they'll read a total of 3 stories in this test. Just so you'll see, what you just saw was a grade 4 story. This is a grade 8 story, the first segment. Okay, so that's a general notion of how the test is administered and how it's scored. I want to say a little bit about how it was developed. It started with the concept of showing something on the screen, letting the student control the amount of time that they had to read that, and then having them answer a question about that after the screen had disappeared, so they could not go back and reread the segment. We did a number of pilot studies with various kinds of content and also various kinds of administration formats and various kinds of scoring. And these pilot studies were done one-on-one using paper materials where the examiner watched the student turn the page and recorded their times and their accuracy. And what this indicated was that even in these small pilot studies with relatively crude materials, that the rate of reading was highly reliable, about 0.9, across different sets of segments, and also correlated around 0.7 with standard either state or summative reading tests. We also found that the best type of content was a story in segments. We experimented with true-false statements, with other kinds of complex sentences, and came to the conclusion, based on feedback and also data, that a set of segments that went together into a story was the most effective method. We tried this at grade 2 and found that at that grade, even in the spring of grade 2, that students were not really engaging in the task in the same way as older students because they were focusing on decoding. They would often read aloud even though we had told them that they should not, and they were often incorrect on the questions, so that they were not really focusing on comprehension. And finally, we determined that giving feedback, correct, incorrect, after each question worked best at getting students to attend. So this is the general layout of the Silent Reading Fluency test. The student reads several stories, each of which is broken into 4 segments, with a question following each segment. The questions are all, the stories are all leveled by reading maturity metric, and we give feedback after each question and also after each story. Why are the segments the length that they are? They're about 40 to 45 words per segment. That decision was based on our feeling that we wanted to have many independent observations. For general measurement accuracy, it's good to have many opportunities for the student to demonstrate their ability, and therefore get many independent pieces of data that give you a more accurate and valid piece of information. And a second reason was to minimize the amount to which memory of a lengthier passage might affect performance, since the students can't go back. Why give feedback? Encourage the students to pay attention. And in that way, we hope to let the students self-monitor their pace and slow down if they need to. We did a tryout at grades 4 to 8. The scoring of the test is based on, as I mentioned earlier, the number of words that the students read on a screen divided by the number of seconds that they spent looking at that screen before going to the question, times 60, giving a words per minute. and then taking a median of those screen words per minute to get an overall story words per minute, and then an overall words per minute for the entire set of 3 stories. This gives you an idea of the kind of data that we got in Tryout for a single segment in question. So this shows for a 4th grade segment of 40 or 40 words in this case, the distribution of the amount of time that students spent on the screen looking at that segment before they went to the question. And the median time was 17 seconds, which is about 141 words per minute. And it's an interesting distribution in that we have a little bump down at the lower left between 0 and 10 seconds, which is rather suspicious. What is that about? The rest of the distribution looks like what you would normally expect. If we also show question accuracy, that is the percent of students who answered this particular question correctly, we see that below 10 seconds of reading time on the screen, accuracy for a 3-choice question is just about at chance level. And right at 10 seconds or so, that bumps up to the actual optimal level of close to 90% accuracy on this question. So this reinforces the notion that what we're seeing with this kind of a distribution of reading time is some students at the lower left who are really not reading the passage, who are rushing through it, and who are therefore not being accurate on the questions. What we've done to deal with that is to add a feature where the student cannot click next on a segment. That is, they must spend a certain minimum amount of time on the segment before moving to the question. And that minimum amount of time is specific to the particular segment and because it's based on the data that we're looking, the kind of data we're looking at in this slide. So in this particular case, the next button would be disabled until 10 seconds had elapsed, because we know from this kind of information that students who click next before 10 seconds are virtually never really comprehending the passage. So that enabled eliminating that kind of spurious, very high words per minute. This is an indication of just how easy the questions are. I want to stress that this is not really a test of proficiency of comprehension. It is a test of rate of reading with comprehension, so the questions should be easy. And as you can see, this shows the number of correct out of a set of 4 questions associated with the story. And at grade 4, as you can see, the long bars for correct, most students were getting a perfect score on each story. We standardized this in the 2013-14 school year around the country. And the only other two new pieces of information on this slide, one is that on the 12 questions, which are 4 questions for each of 3 stories, in order to get a valid rate score, the student must have at least 9 of the 12 correct. And we found that the average administration time in standardization was 7.5 minutes. So it's a relatively brief administration, especially considering that it's self-administered. This gives an indication of its reliability, which is the consistency of the rate of reading across stories. So the rate of reading is highly consistent within an administration session on different stories. It's also fairly consistent across seasons. This is grade 4 between fall and winter, and you can see that there's a lot of consistency between the scores at the 2 times, so it has a fair bit of stability. It's not as stable as oral reading fluency is, which tends to be up in the upper 80s, but it's still a fairly stable measure. And this is a summary of that inter-season stability across the grade levels. And as you can see, this stability is consistent from grades 4 through 8. This shows a correlation of the rate score with various other measures. So in the first column, we're looking at the correlations between the Silent Reading Fluency Rate, words per minute, and oral reading fluency at that grade, which averages 61. Secondly, we have a comparison of scores with a passage comprehension test, which is part of the new aimsweb Plus, and comparing the predictive validity of the silent reading fluency with that of the oral reading fluency. And as you can see, silent reading fluency is a little lower than oral reading fluency against this criterion. And finally, correlations with a vocabulary measure, which is also part of aimsweb Plus. This illustrates the relationship of silent reading fluency words per minute to oral reading fluency words per minute, words correct per minute, at grade 4. And what this shows is the red line would be the equality line or the identity line. That is, the red line is where the rates are equal on the two measures. And the black line is the best fitting line that describes the data. And the data indicate that rates of reading are very similar between oral reading fluency and silent reading fluency across much of the range of performance. Sensitivity to growth is another critical feature or capability of any measure of fluency that's going to be used in progress monitoring. And what this is showing is comparing the sensitivity to growth and change in words per minute between fall and spring by grade, between oral reading fluency in red and silent reading fluency in blue. And as you can see, they're very similar in terms of the magnitude of the sensitivity to growth. Oral reading fluency is a little higher, but both of them are very strong relative to many tests that are available for use in tracking performance in growth in reading. The final piece of data I want to show you is just an illustration of the relationship between accuracy or comprehension accuracy and reading rate, and this is in particular grade 7. So in this chart, the blue lines bars show the number of students at each number of questions correct. So you can see that about half of the students at grade 7 in the fall were perfect on their questions, answered all the questions correctly. Another quarter of students answered 11 out of 12 correctly. So the great majority of students answered 11 or 12 correctly, or even, and if you looked at 9 to 12 correctly, which is a criterion, it's an overwhelming number of students who are at that level of accuracy. And in that range of accuracy, there's a positive relationship between rate and accuracy. So faster students tend to be more accurate. More accurate students tend to read more quickly within this range of reasonable comprehension accuracy. There are about 8% of students, and we've seen this in a number of different samples, it's a fairly consistent finding across grades, whose accuracy is low and for whom rate becomes quite high. And again, for these students, because they are not comprehending, rate is not really an indicator of their rate of reading with comprehension because of their poor comprehension. So these are students who are really moving through the text either without the ability or without the intention or effort to comprehend what they're reading. I want to summarize this portion simply by saying that the impetus for developing the silent reading fluency was to have a substitute for oral reading fluency that would be sensitive to growth, be a valid predictor of reading performance, be self-administered, and be a natural task, and have a comprehension requirement. We've learned through the research done through development and following development that comprehension-based silent reading rate is not the same as oral reading rate. The two are different. Silent reading fluency measures the rate at which the student reads while comprehending what they read as they read. So it's a real-time measure. It's not a measure of reading comprehension, rather it's a measure of the automaticity or efficiency of obtaining meaning from text. And with that mention of meaning, I want to turn it over to Dr. Hebert, who will talk about particular of the aspects, issues regarding comprehension.